It was just after midnight in Western Europe, 1944. The front line was quiet. Too quiet. Orders had already been written. Maps had already been marked. By morning, an entire sector would no longer exist as planned. By late 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a dangerous phase. The rapid advances of previous months had slowed. Front lines stretched thin across forests, ruined villages, and temporary supply routes. Commanders spoke of momentum, but beneath the surface, the system was under strain. Units were exhausted. Equipment was worn. Communication lines were fragile. This sector was considered secondary. Not quiet, but stable enough to hold through the night. Infantry divisions occupied defensive positions along a shallow line of trenches and improvised strongpoints. The terrain was uneven. Muddy ground. Narrow roads. Sparse cover. Visibility was poor even during daylight. At night, it became almost absolute darkness. Intelligence reports were incomplete. Reconnaissance flights had been limited by weather. Patrols reported nothing unusual, only distant movement and the sound of engines far beyond the tree line. Analysts assumed routine repositioning. The assumption was recorded. The assumption was accepted. Orders came down to hold position. No retreat planned. No reserves immediately available. Supply convoys were delayed. Ammunition was rationed. Radios worked intermittently. Field telephones ran through exposed lines, often cut and repaired multiple times a day. The soldiers knew the night would be tense. They always were. But nothing suggested collapse. The enemy had been quiet for days. Artillery had fallen silent. Even the usual probing attacks had stopped. To some officers, this silence felt reassuring. To others, it felt wrong. Command staff gathered in dimly lit rooms. Maps were spread across wooden tables. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Decisions were made quickly. There was confidence in the line. Confidence in discipline. Confidence in routine. At the front, soldiers adjusted their positions. Weapons were cleaned again. Helmets pulled lower. Coats tightened against the cold. Some men wrote letters. Others stared into the darkness ahead. The night was unusually still. No wind. No flares. No distant gunfire. Shortly before midnight, a report arrived. It mentioned movement. Not confirmed. Possibly armor. Possibly nothing. The report was logged but not escalated. There were too many false alarms. Too many wasted responses earlier that month. The defensive line remained unchanged. What no one fully understood was that the enemy was no longer probing. It was assembling. Quietly. Methodically. Just beyond the reach of observation. Waiting for the moment when reaction would be too slow. Midnight approached. The system was already failing. No alarms sounded. No orders changed. The first impact came without warning. Not artillery. Not infantry fire. Communications failed. Radio channels filled with static. Field phones went silent almost at once. Runners were sent, but the roads were already dangerous. In the darkness, movement became chaotic. Units lost contact with each other within minutes. Then the artillery began. It was precise. Concentrated. Focused on known command points and supply routes. Dugouts collapsed. Vehicles burned before engines could start. The timing was exact. Every strike landed where coordination mattered most. Infantry positions were hit next. Not by mass assault, but by isolation. Small enemy units slipped through gaps in the line. Gaps that had existed for weeks, unnoticed. They cut wire. They destroyed relay points. They blocked narrow roads with disabled vehicles. Confusion spread faster than fear. Orders could not move forward. Reports could not move back. Officers made decisions based on fragments of information. Some ordered withdrawal. Others ordered resistance. No one knew what neighboring units were doing. A counterattack was attempted near a crossroads shortly after 1 a.m. It failed almost immediately. The supporting armor never arrived. The road had already been cut. Infantry advanced alone into fire they could not see. Losses mounted quickly. By 2 a.m., the defensive line no longer existed as a continuous force. It had become isolated pockets of resistance. Some held for hours. Others collapsed within minutes. The enemy did not rush. They pressed slowly, relentlessly, letting confusion do most of the work. Command headquarters attempted to relocate. Vehicles were destroyed on the road. Maps were abandoned. Documents burned in the dark. A senior officer was reported missing during the move. His body was never recovered. Requests for air support were sent too late. Weather conditions prevented any immediate response. Dawn was still hours away. Soldiers fought without knowing the larger situation. Some believed they were holding the line. Others believed they were already surrounded. Both were correct. By the time higher command understood what was happening, the window for recovery had closed. Reserves were too far. Routes were blocked. The night belonged to the collapse. The failure was not one moment. It was many small failures, aligning. And it was still unfolding. The collapse reached its peak just before dawn. Encircled units ran out of ammunition. Some attempted breakout movements under cover of darkness. Most failed. Machine gun fire cut down columns before they reached open ground. Others surrendered in silence, weapons dropped into the mud. In one sector, an entire battalion ceased to exist as an organized force. Command structure was gone. Flags were burned. Radios destroyed. Survivors scattered into the countryside in small groups, hoping to reach friendly lines that no longer existed. Medical aid was overwhelmed. Field hospitals were hit during the night. Stretcher routes were impossible to maintain. Wounded men lay where they fell, calling out until voices faded. At first light, the scale of the disaster became visible. Abandoned vehicles lined the roads. Burned supply trucks. Destroyed artillery pieces. Personal equipment scattered across fields and ditches. Bodies lay where they had been caught in the open. The enemy consolidated positions quickly. Defensive lines were reversed. Observation posts now looked back toward territory held only hours earlier. The collapse had reshaped the front in a single night. Official casualty numbers were never clear. Records were lost. Units were merged or dissolved. Missing soldiers were listed without details. Some were later found in prisoner camps. Others were never accounted for. The command response was brief and controlled. Reports described a temporary setback. The sector was renamed. Maps were redrawn. Attention moved elsewhere. There were no public announcements. No headlines. No memorials at the time. For the men who survived, the night remained sharp and unfinished. They remembered confusion. Darkness. Silence between explosions. Orders that never came. The battle had no single name. No clear beginning. No clear end. Only a night when everything fell apart. After the war, the front line moved again. Official maps were corrected. New arrows were drawn. The sector received a different name. What happened that night was absorbed into statistics. Units were rebuilt on paper. Numbers replaced faces. Losses were rounded. Missing men became entries without details. Some files carried question marks. Most carried nothing at all. Survivors were reassigned. They rarely spoke about the night. There was no language for it. Only fragments. Dark roads. Broken radios. Orders that never arrived. Villages near the collapse were repaired. Walls were rebuilt with new stone. Roofs replaced the burned beams. Fields were plowed again. Tracks of tanks disappeared under soil and grass. No signs marked where the line broke. No plaques explained the silence. Travelers passed through without knowing. The ground kept its memory. People did not. Reports described the event briefly. A failure of coordination. A temporary loss of ground. Operational confusion under night conditions. Nothing more. There was no single battle name. No date widely remembered. No clear hour recorded. Only during the night. Only before dawn. Families waited for answers. Some received letters months later. Some received none. Names were misspelled. Units were listed incorrectly. Corrections were never made. A few men returned years later. From camps. From hospitals. From places not written on any map. They carried memories that did not fit official narratives. They remembered how quiet it was before it began. They remembered the sudden loss of direction. They remembered realizing that no one was in control. That the system had failed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But completely. The night did not end with a decisive moment. There was no final stand. No dramatic last order. It dissolved instead. Into confusion. Into separation. Into silence. By morning, the collapse was already history. By afternoon, it was already being replaced. By the end of the week, attention had shifted elsewhere. Another sector. Another operation. Another set of losses. Time did the rest. Documents aged. Ink faded. Folders were moved deeper into archives. Some were never opened again. Some were destroyed without review. The men who fell that night did not become symbols. They did not become stories taught widely. They remained part of a forgotten margin. A gap between larger victories and larger defeats. The land remembers differently. It remembers weight. Fire. Movement in the dark. Then stillness. At night, the roads are quiet again. The forests stand unchanged. No markers point to the failure. No warnings remain. Only absence. The collapse did not change the outcome of the war. It did not delay victory long enough to be remembered. It did not fit a narrative of triumph or tragedy. So it faded. The night stayed where it was. Between pages. Between decisions. Between names that were never called again. Forgetting did not happen suddenly. It happened naturally. One omission at a time. And history moved forward. Leaving that night behind. Thank you for watching. New historical stories are published regularly.